The first thing that becomes necessary for us to do when we're speaking about the planets is we have to speak about the glyphs of the planets themselves. Within traditional astrology, the 7 classical planets of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon all have a specific glyph attached to them. Each glyph is meant to give us some understanding and some insight into the internal operations and functioning of that planet. Every planetary glyph is composed of either the crescent, the circle, or the cross. Within the Hermetic tradition, the crescent corresponds with the moon, the circle corresponds with the sun, and the cross corresponds with the material world. When we think about the crescent corresponding with the moon, we're also referring to the crescent as a thing that corresponds to the morphic field out of which we all arise. Within the Corpus Hermetica, and I dare say even within the Bible, we're given this idea that this world first began as a radical wet substance. And in the Bible, we hear that in the beginning, the world was without form and void, and the Spirit of the Lord moved across the face of the deep. So we're given this imagery or this impression that the foundational field of being out of which everything arose was this primordial wetness, this primordial soup, this primordial chaos that had no distinct features about itself. All of this corresponds with the moon from both a Hermetic as well as a Western mystical perspective, because the moon has to do with the raw forces of nature that are unbridled, that are untamed. The moon is the dragon who is slain by every solar hero that we find within our mythological cycles. The moon is representing the Leviathan. The moon is representing the Hydra, who, as Hercules chops off one head, 3 other heads grow, because the moon is meant to represent the rawness of cosmic potency that is completely without form and void, and that raw field of chaos is fundamentally the ground of being out of which we all arise for one tiny moment within our lifetimes before we completely get reabsorbed into that foundational ground of being. Within Celtic mythology, the moon is represented by the figure of Sheila na gig. Sheila na gig is thought to be this withered old woman who sits down with her legs spread, and she is completely naked, and she takes her fingers into her vagina, and she pulls across the lips of her vulva as a means of extending from within herself tentacles, and those tentacles pull back into her body the souls of the departed. This is very strong imagery, this idea that the foundational field of being is a mother, and that we call her chaos, and that she spreads herself not only as a means of giving birth to us as we step into this physical plane, but also as a means of drawing us back deeply into her body when we are alive no more. And so the moon is representing all of this. And as a means of us separating ourselves from that cosmic lunar chaos, we all have to individualize ourselves through the power of the sun, which is why throughout history we always hear about the solar hero chopping off the head of Medusa, because there is this sense of us needing to beat the raw forces of nature into some form of submission so that we can actually create a life for ourselves independent and separate and apart from those raw forces of nature. Which is why when we take a look at the sun card within the Kabbalistic tarot, there is this child who is riding on a horse holding a red banner that he's carrying forward with him. And behind him is represented the raw forces of nature in the form of the sunflowers that grow behind the man-made wall and the sun that is beating in the sky above him. So within the sun card, we have this imagery of what the individual soul has to do within the birthing process to allow itself to be separate and apart and hermetically sealed within its individual soul. It has to separate itself from nature and, in a sense, dominate nature, as we see the child riding on the back of the horse, in order for the individual soul to fulfill its destiny within this lifetime. We as human beings are meant to use nature as a vehicle for us to fulfill our natal promise and our natal destiny within this lifetime. So the moon is representing that raw portion of nature that needs to be tamed for the purpose of life to actually exist. Within the Sefer HaBahir, which is the Book of Splendor within the Kabbalah, we are told that Hashem, or God, in creating the world, he had to carve a hole inside the heart of chaos. God had to carve a hole inside the darkness of space. And in that hole, God poured his infinite light, just a ray of his infinite light. And that ray of his infinite light was meant to give life to all the forms and expressions of life that exist within that singularity, within the thick body of chaos. What that means is that our physical reality and our physical universe has been carved out of the body of chaos. And in that carving, our universe has been planted. However, this is meant to be an indication to us that there will always be more chaos than there will be matter. There will always be more ocean than there are things within it. There will always be more of Sheila Nagig than there are the children who she gives birth to. So our existence within this physical reality as physical beings with physical bodies is a fantasy. It's an illusion. Because if at any moment in time, the larger chaos within which our universe has been planted, if at any moment in time that larger chaos was to remember that we actually were there, and if that chaos were to choose to re-engulf our universe into chaos, it could completely do that, and our entire universe would be completely annihilated. So thick are those walls that Hashem, or that God, built around our physical universe, so that we can continue going on feeling as if we have a physical, personal destiny to fulfill within this world. So thick are the walls that guard and protect our universe from the larger chaotic forces within which it exists, because there will always be more chaos than there is physical universe. And that chaos is represented by the moon glyph that we see within our planetary glyphs. The moon glyph is also having to do with that part of the individual human being that is connected with that primordial field of chaotic existence. And when we say chaotic, we need to not think about this word chaotic as representing something evil, because chaos was the mother goddess of all of the other gods that exist within our Greek pantheon. Chaos was a mother. And it's interesting how we associate the word chaos with something that's evil, or we associate the word chaos with something that's demonic, because through the passing of time, there has always been this assault against the woman. There has always been this assault against the mother deity as a figure within our collective consciousness, and there has always been this attempt to defile the divinity of the mother deity and turn her into something negative or turn her into something evil. So today we assume that chaos is something to be avoided, when in fact the word chaos simply describes the eternal field of being out of which we all arise to exist within our individual lifetime, and to which we all return when we share this life no more. The moon that we see within our planetary glyphs is meant to represent that part of our individuality that is still connected to that morphic field of eternal chaos, or that morphic field of eternal potential. And within our spiritual anatomy, we call that part of ourselves the spirit. And the spirit is meant to be higher than the soul, because the soul is representing the individualizing factor within all of us, whereas our spirit is representing that part of all of us that is everlasting and eternal and not bound in any way to this physical reality. So it's interesting that within Latin, our word for the sun is soul, because that same sun that we call S-O-L, soul, is the same sun that metaphysically is corresponding with our S-O-U-L, soul within us, as a part of ourselves that allows us to be individualized and in radiant expression. So that is what the circle glyph is representing wherever we see that within any of our planetary glyphs. And finally, the final glyph of the planets is going to be the cross of matter. We consider this cross to be the cross of matter because the cross is composed of the horizontal feminine line that represents the female principle within nature, and the vertical masculine line, which is representing the phallic male principle within nature. When these two concepts come into contact or come into dialogue with each other, or we can say when the lunar horizontal tides come into contact or come into dialogue with the vertical solar tides, they create something that is neither sun nor moon. They create something that is completely independent and separate of themselves. They create a third thing. And the third thing that they create is the cross of matter. So the cross of matter is meant to symbolize this coming together of the male and female principles and how those two principles get locked or frozen in time and space in each other, and how that idea or that concept of freezing is carried out in a very physical and material sense in terms of the establishment of our material plane. So wherever we see the symbol of the cross within the Western mystery tradition, it is always meant to represent the material world, because from the quadripartite nature of the cross, or from the fourfold nature of the cross, we then derive the four elements of the fire, the water, the air, and the earth. And as we know from a traditional astrological perspective, those four elements are essentially the foundational elements that constitute the creation of everything within our physical world. So when we see the glyph of the cross within any of our planetary glyphs, it is meant to bring up within us this idea of not only the physical world, but our own physicality within this world through the human body. So when we bring these three concepts into concert or conversation with each other, what we end up with is the crescent of spirit that is connected to the eternal, that is connected to the morphic field out of which we all arose, which is representing a feminine principle that exists within us all. We find the circle of the sun, which is representing the individual solar principle within us all, which is corresponding with our soul in just the same way as the crescent is corresponding with our spirit. And finally, we find the cross of matter, corresponding with our physical body, which is the coming together of these two potencies of the horizontal lunar principle and the vertical phallic masculine solar principle. So these three glyphs, the crescent, the circle, and the cross, are representing our spirit, our soul, and the physical body, which is our vehicle within this lifetime. And from a traditional perspective, these three glyphs are found only within the glyph of the planet Mercury. And this is one of the reasons why Mercury is the most powerful symbol from an astrological perspective. This is one of the reasons why Mercury is placed as the god of astrology and of magic. This is the reason why Mercury is the god and the patron of alchemy, because Mercury is holding within himself these three cosmic principles, which no other planet from a traditional astrological perspective has the ability to hold. Mercury is holding within himself the keys to unlocking the kingdom of the universe. And from a traditional mythological perspective, we hear this about Mercury all the time, but we never actually question it. We hear that Mercury is the only god who can ascend to the highest heights of heaven and dive into the deepest parts of hell. We hear that Mercury as a planet is the only planet that has the ability to hold two warring principles within himself as representing his intrinsic nature, because all of the other planets are either holding hot and dry within themselves, as is the nature of the Sun and Mars, or hot and wet within themselves, as is the nature of Venus, the Moon, and Jupiter, or cold and dry within themselves, as is the nature of Saturn, or we even have the water element, which is corresponding with this idea of coldness and moisture. Even though within the cosmology of Ptolemy, there is no planet that is cold and moist, and we'll explain why that is as we go through this series on the planets. But we have all of the other principles and factors within nature holding heat and moisture, heat and dryness, cold and moisture, or cold and dryness. Mercury is the only planet that has the ability to hold two warring principles within himself and not be destroyed by the contradiction of that process. Mercury, from Ptolemy's perspective, is wet and dry at the same time, which a lot of traditional astrologers within the medieval period and even before the medieval period took great umbrage with, because everything else made sense within Ptolemy's universe except this allotment of wetness and dryness to Mercury. But the point is, it's not supposed to make sense. Mercury is not supposed to make sense in any of our human ways of rationalizing our world, because Mercury is not meant to truly be in this world. This is a part of why Mercury has his house of terrestrial joy in the twilight house, in the ascendant, because Mercury is meant to be straddling the divide between two worlds at all times. Mercury is not supposed to be understandable. Mercury isn't even supposed to be something that we're able to look at for very long. So Mercury is the point of everything from within the context of the Western mystery tradition. We are meant to become like Mercury, able to hold contradiction within our being without being destroyed by the contradiction between those two opposing forces. We are meant to be cold and hot at the same time, and wet and dry at the same time. Because when we're able to do that, that is actually what magic is. When we're able to hold warring forces and make those warring forces be in conversation with each other, that is actually what magic is. Which is why in the glyph of Mercury, we find this summation of the entire goal of the Western mystery tradition. Because the entire goal of the Western mystery tradition is for us to alchemize ourselves in such a way whereas we can be both this and that at the same time. We can be both particle and wave at the same time. We can be both liquid and solid at the same time. All of this is held and captured within this glyph of Mercury, and the glyph of Mercury is holding within itself all of the elements necessary to create the remaining 6 planetary glyphs that we find within traditional astrology.